There's a story economists love to tell about August 5th, 2011, the day America lost its AAA credit rating for the first time in history. Markets panicked, politicians pointed fingers, and the US debt crossed what was then considered an unthinkable line: $14 trillion. What nobody knew at the time was that this moment wouldn't be remembered as a peak, but as a warning. A warning we didn't listen to. Today, that number has more than doubled. The US debt clock looks less like an accounting tool and more like a runaway train, accelerating faster every year, pulling the entire economy behind it. And the big question isn't just why the debt keeps rising, but what happens when ordinary Americans start feeling the impact directly in their wallets. In 1984, President Ronald Reagan joked that the national debt was big enough to take care of itself. 40 years later, it's big enough to take care of everyone, and not in a good way. Back then, the interest on the national debt wasn't even a major budget item. Today, the US is spending more on debt interest than on national defense. This matters now because for the first time in modern history, the cost of simply servicing the debt, paying interest, not touching the principal, has become one of the fastest growing expenses in the federal budget. And when Washington pays more for interest, it means you pay more for everything from mortgages to credit cards. So, how did the debt become a runaway train? The US didn't get here overnight. The rise in federal debt has been driven by three structural forces: persistent deficits, regardless of which party is in power; an aging population, which increases Social Security and Medicare costs; and finally, higher interest rates, making existing debt significantly more expensive. The Congressional Budget Office projects that interest payments alone will hit $1.1 trillion in 2025. This isn't a cyclical problem, it's structural, and that's what makes it so dangerous. In the past, economic growth helped absorb deficits. But today, spending is rising faster than GDP, while revenues struggle to keep up. For example, every year, programs tied to retirement and healthcare automatically grow. Meanwhile, tax revenues depend heavily on market performance, which is anything but stable. In fact, a staggering 60% of all federal spending in 2024 was mandatory and growing automatically. This means even if Congress froze all discretionary spending tomorrow, the debt would still rise. Then there's the interest rate shock, which I call the silent killer. For a decade, ultra-low interest rates made debt feel painless. Well, that era is gone. The average interest rate on US debt has risen from 1.5% to over 3%, effectively doubling the interest costs. Think about it this way. If you refinanced your mortgage at 7.5% instead of 3%, your monthly payment would skyrocket. The US government is experiencing the exact same problem, just on a scale of trillions. Higher rates mean higher deficits. Here's where the runaway train hits home for you. It means higher mortgage rates, more expensive credit card debt, lower purchasing power, and eventually, either higher taxes or fewer services in the future. Why? Because when the government spends more on interest, everything else, from infrastructure to education, is left competing for a smaller pot of money. The average American household is now paying about $1,000 more per year in interest just due to these rate hikes. If you're learning something new today, hit the like button so this video can reach more people. So, is a debt crisis coming? Most economists don't predict a sudden collapse. The US still controls the world's reserve currency, but they do warn of a slow bleed scenario, where interest payments crowd out investments, growth slows, and future generations inherit a much weaker economic foundation. As former Fed Vice Chair Richard Clarida said, debt problems don't matter until suddenly they do. What happens if this train doesn't slow down? If debt keeps rising unchecked, America faces three likely outcomes, none of them good. Higher taxes to fund interest payments, spending cuts that hit popular social programs or even the military, or inflationary pressure as the government is tempted to print more money to finance its spending. None of these options are politically popular, but eventually they become economically unavoidable. The debt isn't just a Washington issue, it's an everything issue. It affects the dollar's strength, your retirement savings, your borrowing costs, and the government's ability to respond to future crises. The biggest lesson here is that debt doesn't explode all at once. It erodes, slowly, quietly, relentlessly. As interest rates remain elevated, expect more warnings from credit rating agencies, bigger budget fights in Congress, and rising pressure on the Federal Reserve to cut rates prematurely. But the most important question of all is this: what happens when interest payments become the single biggest line item in the entire U.S. budget? Do you think the U.S. will ever get its debt under control? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And coming up in our next video, we'll explore why China is quietly dumping U.S. treasuries and what that means for the future of the dollar. In today's video, we uncovered why America's debt is rising faster than ever and how it is already shaping your everyday financial life. If you found value here, subscribe to Inside U.S. Finance for clear, data-driven analysis every week. Thanks for watching.